So I'm William Rubel, and welcome to my 28th Bread History Seminar Workshop. I appreciate you all coming. And yes, the clapping, that's a good thing. Max just did that. When we get to the end, this is a new thing I've introduced. I actually teach a creative writing class on Saturdays to children. And when they finish reading, we go off mute and clap. And I do think that we can make these sort of virtual meetings a bit more real to come off and it creates an ending to the performance. So please think of that at the end. Okay. I have a Facebook group, Bread History and Practice. Many of you are on it. Several of you, like Jeff, for example, Pavlik post regularly. That is where the discussion from these seminars continues, as well as lots of other really super interesting posts. I learn a lot. It's a fabulous Facebook group. So whatever your relationship is with Facebook, there really is no substitute for these professional groups. So please consider joining and joining the discussion there. I do have a website I pay somewhat of attention to, williamrubel.com. I'm sort of getting back to that. And I also have a small bread history, Bread, a Global History, that is easily acquirable for under $20 at Amazon, both in paper or in Kindle edition. So bread is an invention, like a chair, a car, a shoe, a necklace. No agriculturalist, no farmer in Northern Ireland or any place in the world has ever harvested a bread. And I think we just can't ever lose track of that as we think about breads, eat breads, see breads when we travel in different places. This is an expression of culture. Every single choice made, from grain, wheat's what we think of as bread, mostly, a little bit of rye, occasionally barley. But why? Why the wheat? Why aren't we still eating barley breads? That was also a foundation grain. Rye was also a foundation grain in the Levant. Why wheat? Why white bread is so common? So it's an invention of humans, and everything we do is affected by culture. And this book that I'm talking about today is a fabulous text because it really explicitly comes up against the problem of bread and culture. We're going to be dealing with an author who has an idea, which is this way of making bread where you just work from previous batch to next batch to next batch forever. And the people he was writing to, they weren't interested. So it's really a head against the wall kind of text, which just reminds us that inventions have their time and place. We all, there's that incredible clock-like machine from ancient Greece, but it was a dead end. It was a dead end. It took 2,000 years to get back to that kind of level of complex geared technology. When you look up in the stars at night, if you can see them, if you're fortunate enough to see them, to live outside the city, there's all kinds of patterns there, all kinds of stories that we see in the stars. But one of the stories that is not there is what is the best bread. That is a story that is held within our hearts. And Cochrane also, the subject of the talk today is John Cochrane's text, The Seaman's Guide, that, as Jeff said, we bonded over some years ago, was up against a cultural issue. Jane Austen, who was very conservative, many of her characters are very conservative British culture. We talked about this in the talk on French bread. Not interested in French bread at all. They were into the English muffin. She has a character who says this: I did not quite like at breakfast to hear you talk so much about the French bread at Northanger. I'm sure I do not care about the bread. It's all the same to me what I eat. So today we're going to be dealing with a text where the author cares about the bread in a culture that isn't caring. This is our hero, John Cochrane. He lived from 1750 to 1801. He was the second son of an earl, and that was not good for him. First, as he had to wear this ridiculous costume, and I think he felt he needed to be dour and stiff. He also, as we'll see in bits of the text that I'm going to read today, and when you read the text yourselves, because I have made an annotated edition, which I'm still completing, and I'm going to send a copy to all of you. He is bigoted. He is really snobbish. He looks down on every single one of us. We don't have blue running in our veins. He thinks that everybody but him and his class is stupid. And his sort of class biases get in the way of his polemic, which this text really is, because he is constantly insulting the very people he's trying to convince. He calls bakers stupid. He calls them idiots. He does call them stupid. He says they're inflexible. They're basically troglodytes. He's got a lot of bad things to say that interfere with his ability to communicate. But he went to India when he was 16. He was the assistant paymaster to the British colonial powers in North America, stationed in Quebec in the 1780s. And there he got bitten by the sourdough bug. And once he discovered the sourdough bug and the Quebec oven that Jeff mentioned, this became this really massive passion of his. And I think that we should better imagine him in jeans and a t-shirt, or dressed sort of like I am, giving a TED talk. I think he's a person that had a lot of interests, a lot of passions, and he would have been, a TED talker. After Quebec, he went to India, back to India. He bought 4 flour mills. He provisioned the British Navy largely with flour for a few years. And he wrote another book besides the Seaman's Guide we're talking about today, that is very technical, dealing with procurement systems with the East India Company. Where is my cursor? There we are. I'm going to start a little bit differently today. This text was published in 1797. And the historical early modern period ends at 1800, and then we get into the modern. I guess we're the postmodern. This is the year that Beethoven's 4th Piano Sonata was published, and you're going to hear want you to get from that is it's very different from the late sonatas. This is still, you can sort of hear a little bit of Mozart in Haydn, it's a little bit 18th century. It's still a little bit like the way that Cochrane dressed. Napoleon is now in northern Italy. In Italy, the Napoleonic War with Britain hasn't started yet, but the world is changing. The world is changing. The French Revolution is in progress. It's 1797. The United States has broken free and is developing the government that currently seems to be disintegrating. The first smallpox, the first vaccine, 1796, the year before this was printed. So he was writing it. We are at the entree to the modern world, to our world. And we're going to see that in this text, because he specifically says that he's writing a treatise. The first parachute drop, 1797 in Paris, and it was repeated in 1801 in England. The modern world is here. The Albion Mill, which was 1750s, the first mill with steam engines driving it, had been burnt down. This is the fire in 1791. But Cochrane references, and hopefully we get to the text because we may not get to everything that I want to read, but he complains that in these modern mills, they're essentially going too fast. They are denaturing the flour. He says the flour gets to be, quote, dead, end quote. So already a complaint against how industrialization speeds up the system and smashes the craft elegance that had been, is found in this text. So I just think it's a super exciting text. It is also, of course, a colonial text. He owns flour mills in India. His knowledge of Indian flour making is from India and Indian technique, and he, of course, was there as as a colonialist. We have to assume, in addition to his contempt for workers or common seamen, he also will have been very racist and felt that it was his right by the color of his skin and British culture to command the resources of the subcontinent. This is a cross section of a ship, an American ship, but it will be the same. He is addressing his text. It's called the Seaman's Guide, ostensibly to the first Lord of the Admiralty. He wants them to make fresh bread, and he is very proud that he knows that through his systems that they will actually save weight. So he's aware of the difficulties of doing things in ships. I just want to point out the very bottom deck. It's called the orlop, and that is where he points out on French ships they all have the bread ovens, so the bread oven that he recommends for making fresh bread would be in that orlop deck down there at the bottom. So this is the Seaman's Guide. It's a 45-page pamphlet, and it is, I think, the most important bread text that nobody has heard of. I mean, Jeff had heard of it before I met him. So there's many people making these independent discoveries, but really it's through the miracle of Google Books that this book is known. And I think it will become influential because, as Ken said, the bread system is really brilliant. I think rewritten, this could make a bread book that would be popular, not as popular as Tartine. That's not going to happen for another generation, but could be up there as a best-selling bread book in English. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And this is going to be an attempt at an old-fashioned talk. I have a notebook here. It's my annotated version of the Seaman's Guide, and I'm going to read. So what I want to do today is to give you all a sense of the primary source, and I'm going to then sort of riff on these texts and hopefully get done in time. But let me ask, before I jump into it, a show of green hands, a show of electronic hands, who besides Ken made one of the recipes that I sent out? Anybody? Okay, so, oh, you did, Jen, great. Okay, thank you. All right, so this begins, remember you saw that old-fashioned guy. Now this text still has the long S, which is the thing that many people who don't know, they think it looks like an F, but it doesn't have the cross. And 3 years later, and if anybody here, and maybe Malcolm can explain, suddenly all at once, The long S disappeared, and we get the typography we know today. Malcolm, how did that happen around 1800, sort of all at once?
Got no idea.
Okay. Well, anyway, it's totally weird. So this book still, yeah.
I think it was it was one of the simple type costs. They did it with the thorn at the start. You don't get a thorn in most early in books. They start putting a Y instead of the thorn symbol because it costs less to have so many different letters already cast in the type tray. So as printing goes on, they remove the unnecessary letters.
Thank you, Mark. And for somehow they did it all at once. So that's social networking. You know, they
no, you lose the TH earlier, you lose an NG at one point. They all
right.
just,
Oh, right. It
go slowly.
It's progressive, slowly by slowly, and then
Gone.
Turn of the century. So another thing that marks this as an early modern text is it has a dedication. And the dedication, I'm going to read part of it to Earl Spencer. So Spencer is an earl. Remember, he's the son of an earl. They could have known themselves socially. And in this case, Earl Spencer is the first Lord of the Admiralty. And he's written this book ostensibly, at least in the introduction, for him. As we'll see in the text, he is also writing for us. He's thinking even of the home baker. My lord, to a benevolent mind, the possession of power derives its principal value from means it affords of doing good, and, above all, of relieving the distresses and preserving the lives of valuable members of society. I am, therefore, encouraged to dedicate and solicit your lordship's patronage to this pamphlet, written on an important subject, which I know has already engaged your lordship's attention, and on which any hints that may be matured into salutary system, you, my lord, will not disdain. It has been for its object the health and comfort of the British seamen, and of course the dearest interests of our country. If what I have observed shall appear to merit consideration, it may, perhaps, be thought advisable to submit the improvements I propose to a committee of men versed in chemistry, not a few of whom I have already consulted, who may follow them up with experiments that may tend to prove the practicality and advantage of both of which, having been bred to a sea life, I am myself thoroughly persuaded. It goes on a little bit more, but I think there's really two super important ideas. First is, we are smack dab in the Enlightenment. It's about my experience, my feelings, what's happened to me. My experience is more important than those of the ancients. There is nothing in this text that refers to Pliny or what they used to just say, you know, the ancients, Petrarch. There's no references to Greek or Latin literature. And second of all, he says, look, I know ships, but listen, this is science. I have consulted chemists. So this is like what Carl's company I have visited. I've been their guest of Paratos. I've been to their headquarters. You know, this is in Brussels. You know, this is like a cutting edge science baking company making wonderful things for people to eat. But he has consulted chemists and he says, look, don't take my word for this. Get together some scientists and test out what I have to say. So again, we are at the cusp of the old and the energy of the new, of today. We then get to the start of the book, and I'm going to read the first paragraph of the introduction. It begins with the de rigueur, talking about bread as the staff of life. And those of you who have attended my lessons know that I interpret that staff of life in the multiplicity to which staffs are used, which includes police beating people, which includes showing off that you're rich because your staff has a silver top, and indicating your poverty because your staff is just a stick that you picked up from the forest. As bread is the staff of life, forming the greatest proportion of the sustenance of mankind, it is very singular that in all the books on domestic economy and even on cookery, the art of baking bread has not been sufficiently examined and explained, or directions properly given for baking, either with yeast or leaven, according to the situations in which people are placed. In countries where wine is the beverage of the inhabitants, or where no malt liquor is brewed, the use of leaven is general. But where beer is the beverage, yeast is in such use that the mode of baking with leaven is unknown. Insomuch that, on the late stopping of the distilleries, the bakers of this country were, and he's referring to Scotland, as in the summer months, particularly, they often are reduced to great difficulty and expense in procuring it. The following treatise, the result of many experiments and actual practice, is given to the public with view of rendering the principles of baking clear to the meanest capacity by giving such directions for baking with yeast or leaven as will enable either public bakers, private families, camps, men of war, or merchantmen to supply themselves in all situations with soft bread of the best quality. Now, I promised you for this text that this is a text full of insights. And I think we can find here, and here we have a couple insights and sort of confirmations of these questions and resolution of some of the fictitious histories that are common on the internet and in books about the history of bread. One being that everyone made sourdough and yeast is some invention of the modern industrial system and represents a contamination of sort of some kind of purity. The British did not use sourdough in commercial baking in the 18th century, and they didn't in the 17th or 16th, as far as we can tell either. And he's really clear about that. And his is not the only text that addresses the problem that the British bakers simply didn't understand levain. They didn't know how to manage the doughs, but they did have a problem getting yeast. Yeast was acquired from the brewer in England, from the distiller in Scotland, but they were making beer that they distilled into the Scotch. So really, they're also brewers. There were problems sometimes when the weather went bad. They didn't have enough. They weren't producing the ale fast enough. Remember, they don't have temperature-controlled environments. There's no refrigeration, so you get your yeast from the brewer or the distiller. You can't, it deteriorates. So there were problems. Also, the ale got hoppier and hoppier and hoppier. And hops is a bittering agent. And the bittering agent in hops makes an electrical bond to the yeast, an electrical bond. It's bonded to the molecule, so you can wash it and wash it and wash it to your heart's content. You'll never get that bitterness all the way away. And this became a problem. So that is a problem he is partly addressing here in his system that Ken called out, where we're going to use a little bit of leaven, a little bit of yeast or leaven, and then we're just going to keep reusing that dough. And in that way, we are going to eliminate that sour taste. And he goes on to, and then also he says, remember to supply themselves in all situations with soft bread of the best quality. So this is it, what is the best bread is in your heart. It's not in the stars. And we all like to come down on those industrial breads that are more whipped than fermented. And when I buy them, I try to defend them. I do. And it really is depressing when I buy the loaves and I look at them and they haven't even completely stirred it. You see these little lines of unstirred dough. So, they're not applying good craft to it. But this idea of soft bread versus a chewy, crispy bread. It's a cultural idea. And that is the idea of this book and of this period. He's helping you make bread that you're going to like. And the bread that you're going to like is soft. Now, I always get totally lost and have no interest in the modern bread baking books that all get into the intricacies of the fermentation systems of, this enzyme kicks in here, that thing happens there, and you're all focused on all this. I think it's important for commercial baking, of course, because it gives you the ultimate control over taste and texture. But what's fabulous to me about this text is they didn't understand what yeast was. And his confusion, his misunderstanding, his not understanding is something he says that he doesn't understand. But he explains very clearly what they understood. And this will have been the level of understanding since, let me use the beautiful term, time immemorial. They, however, because we're getting in to the modern world in only 3 more years. So he's using jargon. This is a book with jargon that we're all familiar with. You've got the amylase, enzymic reaction and so forth, the jargon that we are all familiar with the good baking books today. There are 3 stages of fermentation through which bread or flour can pass: the vinous, the acetus, and the putrid. If water is added to flour, it immediately enters into the vinous, from whence it almost instantly goes into the acetus fermentation. The first stage, viz., the vinous fermentation, shall here be denominated yeast. The second, or acetus fermentation, leaven. Each of these possesses a singular and astonishing power of communicating fermentation under proper regulation to any quantity of flour and may be continued forever. Okay, this is his insight. Now, it's not an insight unique to him. It seemed to have been, though, an insight of the late 18th century. Edmund Burke wrote this in 1780. This is a complaint against heavy bread, and this is addressed to the stupid female baker who creates bad bread for her family because she is an idiot. Misogynism runs very deep and strongly through 18th and 19th century bread texts. The reason he assigns, so here Burke is quoting somebody else, why people make heavy bread is not because they have not barm enough, but because they do not know that barm is the same to flour as fire is to fuel. So the reason of making bread heavy is it was made up and put in the oven before it was ripe. So there was this idea, that you've got something that is alive, though they're not aware of it being alive, that communicates its power like a spark to fire, which obviously they knew about. It's still a world of live fire, but somehow they didn't have control of it. And what's fabulous about this text is this is the first text where getting control of that spark is found. So this I'm going to give you the first of his recipes. He has 2 recipes here, and it's basically just the sponge method. And I want, though, to point out that I don't know the source of his recipes because he introduces the sponge system. That's where he divides the dough in half, and this is the one that I posted on the website. He divides the dough in half. He then adds leaven to half of it. And when the sponge is spongy, when that whole half is spongy, he mixes the rest of it. But weirdly, I had forgotten this, but this is the first bread recipe in Nicolas de Bonnefont's fabulous set of bread recipes in the Délices de la Campagne, Suite de la Jardinière Française, published in 1655 and translated by John Evelyn as Panificum, a text that I published in the Petit Propos Culinaire and will be a good topic for one of these talks. He also introduces this two-stage system. Bonnefont then follows it with a 6-stage system that really I realize is the 4-stage system that is the recipe number 2. So I don't know whether Cochrane read Bonnefont and picked up this way of structuring recipes from him, or whether he observed this in French bakeries or some other text in English or most likely French. Does anybody in the group know? Have any of you read some other structured recipes as we're going to read here? Just speak up, take yourself off mute and say something. If you haven't, then, especially those of you in French or German, I think German is also a possibility for an early bread text. I see Mark is shaking his head. Okay, these 2 recipes. In baking with yeast, when it is in a good vinous state and in an abundant quantity, the operation is soon performed. The flour in this case being seldom mixed up oftener than twice. That is to say, the yeast is added to half the flour and well kneaded, and is then allowed to sponge and rise in the trough. Next, the other half of the flour is added with a sufficient quantity of water to make it into dough, and then allowed to ferment and rise, when it again will be kneaded and made into loaves. Well, that's your standard, it's in Markham, it's just a standard British way of making bread. Although I will note that I don't remember other recipes where you need it at that stage. And he's going to repeat this recipe again, summarize it at the end where he doesn't need it. So I'm not sure about the kneading at that stage. But we've just got, 2 bits. You leaven half, and then you add the other half. And it also is an important principle that Bonnefont explicitly stated, and Cochrane also states, is you never add more flour than you added to the bit you had leavened to begin with. So the operative word that makes this work is an abundant quantity of the yeast. And really his methods are going to address what happens if you don't have an abundant quantity of yeast. Recipe number 2. The most intelligent bakers, and guys, listen, when you write a bread text or any other bread text, don't divide your audience between the intelligent and the dummies. Okay, the most intelligent bakers divide the flour into 3 parcels, one consisting of a half of the whole and the other 2 1/4 each. They first mix 1/4 of the flour with the whole of the yeast. This they call setting sponge. Suppose this to be done at 11 in the forenoon. At about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they mix another 1/4 of the flour and knead it very well. About 9 at night, they mix up the remaining half of the flour and work it very well up, and it stand until 1 or 2 in the morning, when it's made into loaves and put in the oven. By proceeding in this way, a much less quantity of yeast is sufficient, and the bitter taste of hops is entirely eliminated. Now, again, he does this kneading at the stages. I'm a little skeptical. In Bonnefont's recipe, you clearly make a very wet mix, so that the last time you might not even need to add complete flour. But Bonnefont does it 8 p.m., 10 p.m., and then 6 a.m. So this idea of the structure and that you're adjusting the taste. Now, one thing I noticed making the starters, the bread with Bonifant, but it's the same recipe here, is that no matter how sour your leaven, no matter how sour your starter, it's going to not yield a sour bread. And it works out when you do the maths with the way I was adding, I think 50% starter to my initial beginning, you end up still with only 6% starter, not anything like these American recipes that have 20 or 30% starter in them. And both Bonifant, and I don't know if I'm going to get to the reading because I'm going slow in the reading, they both recommend building out your starter, building out the bread you've held back a couple times before you necessarily start making your bread with it.
William?
Yes.
I do have a book back from 1787, which is coming from Augustin Parmentier. And Augustin Parmentier was a French pharmacist, but he was also into baking, and he wrote this book, Le Traité Parfait de la Boulangerie. So the treatise of the modern baking, or the art of baking. And he has like a chapter at 60 pages about le vin, or le levain chef, le premier levain, le second levain, le troisième levain, ou le levain à point. So where he is explaining, at one moment he says, un levain ne doit pas être aigre. So a sourdough should not be sour. And he was already pushing, and he was mentioning that the bakers are slaves of their sourdough because they have to feed it every 4 hours, and as such cannot sleep more than 3 hours and a half in a row. So this is 1787. He wrote this book.
Thank you, Carl. Carl, would you like to do a session on that chapter?
Yeah, I could, but then you have to give me some time, because I read it a couple of years ago. I have to read it back and take notes, but I would like to do that. Yeah.
Let's do that, and maybe also
I have the book here in a PDF, so I could easily, yeah.
That would be great. It would also be a good chapter for us to translate to English.
I have a bread made with this method. So this is with sourdough. It's baked this morning with sourdough made with just a couple of refreshments with 4 hours in between, and only used at 5% on flour.
Thank you. Wow, interesting. So he's got the same as the Bonifant. Thank you, Carl. And we'll look forward to that. So the French, not just in the 18th century, okay. The French have been ahead with bread since forever. One thing to mention from the Bonifant text is he said something I have never read in any text. Besides that, he says to bake off a little walnut-sized bit of dough, taste it, and then adjust your recipe before you bake up the whole batch. So Parmentier wrote this fantastic text for the boulangerie, for the commercial baker, and a very good little book called Avis à bonne ménager, at the housewife, in 1777. Very short book that is absolutely brilliant. You can get it from the Bibliothèque Nationale, and it's very basic French. If you know any French at all, you're going to be able to read through it. And I will say, though I shouldn't digress too much, that, well, I'm not going to digress. So there's Parmentier, 2 really good books on wheat breads. In 1824, he has a book on maize bread that is good, with some maize breads. And then we also have Malouin, the other giant of the 18th century French bread books. And so, yes, this is not the first treatise, and I did say in English. It is the first time that an English author was methodical in approach. Let's see. So then he says, moving along, he is moving along, and he's saying that to not communicate the bitterness, or not to communicate sourness, it's essential to keep a piece of dough of former baking, which may be preserved for several days, but which ought not to be kept too long. Otherwise, it will get into the putrid fermentation. This piece of sourdough must be mixed with flour and water and allowed to ferment and rise. Then more flour and water must be added until sufficient quantity is made for baking. So he is big on your ability to move back and forth between his vinous and his acetic fermentation to control the taste. On the next page, he's saying the English bakers accustomed to baking with yeast proceed in the same way with leaven. They use too much of it and do not mix it up a sufficient number of times in order to overcome the acidity and thereby change the acetous fermentation into a vinous state. And I think missing from our bread books really is this idea that you're controlling taste. You can make it just what you want. And if you want a sour tasting current American style bread, which the last time I was in Paris, I went to a Kaiser bakery in the Marais, and he was serving a sour tasting bread. I was completely blown away and amazed, completely blown away and amazed. But this is something that we have in control, and this book he's teaching control. Let's see here. Where am I here? Again, thinking back to, maybe this is just me, I'm really sensitive as a literary text to the voice of the author, where he goes on with this insulting phrase, the idea of continuing the fermentation from that batch to another or to the next day is an exertion of mind beyond the bakers, although they see it every day before their eyes in the process of raising the usual quantity of bread. This ignorance or want of attention is not confined to the bakers of this country. He goes on to consult the other bakers. But of course, what he really is up against is cultural practice. It's this, what is the ideal bread that is in your heart? And what I think is just absolutely fabulous, and have always thought since I was studying bread was fabulous, is that England claimed large portions of France. One consequence of the Norman invasion of England, and take our language, half of the words I'm speaking today have French origins, is that we, speaking as an inheritor of the Anglo-Saxon of the English bread tradition, that they didn't bring the French breads along with their French bakers. It wasn't until Queen Elizabeth was the one who finally lost Calais. That's late. I mean, we're already with Shakespeare, and England still controlled parts of France, but they didn't bring in that sourdough until my lifetime. It's quite fabulous. That's only now that you go to Paris and you get, the French chain Paul, or you go to the city bakery at the Borough Market and you get Le Vin breads like in California. So Cochrane's ideas are in many ways ahead of their time.
William, I wanted to ask you a couple questions.
Mm-hmm.
And also make a comment with salt rising bread, and also with the chickpea breads of Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, Syria. They always use a sponge, and those recipes are thousands of years old. I think that's correct, isn't it, Carl?
Sure. I'm sorry to answer it, Carl.
Yeah, I don't know if it's thousands of years old. When I was in Creta with Dimitris, where you've been recently too, they don't really know from when on they do that. I don't know if it's thousands of years old, but it's definitely very old. And it is just a yeast fermentation that is made once, and then they restart all the time from scratch. Yeah.
Yeah,
So it's,
but I wouldn't call it a yeast. I mean, it's a different microbe, of course.
it's mainly Clostridium, but
Right.
there's some yeast involved as well.
Yeah, and bacillus. But I have written a book that's 1,000 years old, and they talk about it there. But
Okay.
anyway, so I wanted to just kind of bring up the idea that this sponge method appears to be very old. And then maybe you're going to get into this, William. How do you procure the acetus stage when you're using a starter or a levain?
Okay. Right. So he followed up. I could read you the footnote. Let me just let's get back to that footnote on the yeast. So he so look, what he's doing is he's defining any dough that is alive as yeast. He also says that he's aware that yeast is a thing, that yeast is a substance. Let's see if I have that here. Have I lost that footnote? One second. When it does not taste sour, so here he says, note, the term yeast, here applied to flour in the vinous fermentation, is not meant to signify that the mass is wholly converted into the substance so termed, arising from fermented malt liquor, and of which a small quantity only is obtained, but to distinguish it from leaven. The nature or essence of yeast or barm, how produced, and from what part of the grain it arises, has never yet been properly examined and explained by scientific men. When once produced, it can be preserved for a great length of time, even in a dry state, and resume its activity when added to water. And any substance capable of fermentation, without a little of this substance to set the fermentation a-going, it is tedious and difficult to create yeast anew, and requires more nicety and patience than can be expected from the bulk of mankind. It's therefore recommended to begin with some fresh yeast. So he is understanding that yeast is something separate, that's a thing, and he's saying we don't know what it is, and it wasn't until the 1860s when Pasteur discovered it. So he's calling any sponge, whether it's produced by yeast actually or levain, but that does not taste sour, as yeast. And then once it starts to sour, then that's the acetic fermentation.
William?
Yes.
On page, if you go to the next page, page 4,
Yeah.
at the bottom of that same note,
Yeah.
one of the most fascinating things I've always found is the last sentence. The dried substance of yeast, as now put up and sold in containers, in canisters, is by far the simplest means of obtaining that useful article. So at some
That's right.
point by the late 18th century, we have dry yeast in canisters. What
That's
it looks
common.
like, how it's sold. I mean, I've never found an ad. I've searched it's still an ongoing project, is to figure out what that sentence means. And it's there.
That's right. And yeast has been dried forever, but there seems to have been actually a commercial system. Industrial yeast was being produced and exported from Germany by the early 19th century. In 1813, Buckingham Palace was getting yeast from Germany. There were big import duties on it. In 1850 or so, the British government withdrew the import duties, eliminated all import duties on yeast, and then the figures for yeast importing did whatever it's called, where your curve goes like that, and by 1860. Every single bakery in England was using German yeast. Okay. I will summarize, so I get to the rest of this text, his summary of his master bread recipe, okay? He repeats at the end and he summarizes it, and I think this is the best statement of the recipe. Take a piece of dough and keep it for use. And listen, if you start with a yeasted dough, this is what I do. I have no patience for sourdough. I can't keep sourdough starters going. What I do is I just make a yeasted bread, but I make extra. I put it in my refrigerator, and then I start making breads from those, and it starts to develop a sour um, taste, and you end up with a sourdough starter with Saccharomyces cerevisiae being the dominant yeast. It's the dominant yeast in most starters anyway, not all starters, as Carol will say. They have a few examples in their library of starters that don't use Saccharomyces cerevisiae. But remember, it's a semi-domesticated organism. It's in my spit. It's on my tabletop. It's everywhere here, and it's in most of our starters. Take a piece of dough and keep it for use. It will keep for several days very well. Mix the dough with some warm water, not very hot, and knead it with some flour to ferment and sponge. Divide the flour into 4 parts. Mix a quarter of the flour with the leaven and a sufficient quantity of water to make it into dough. Again, I guess he says again, knead it well. Let this remain until it ferments and rises properly, then dilute it with more water, add another quarter of the flour, and let it rise. Do the same with the other 2 quarters of the flour, 1 quarter after another, taking particular care never to mix more flour until the last has risen. That is the key to success. When finished, divide it into loaves. Now listen to this. I'm not aware of this ever having been written in English before. And let the loaves remain to rise in order to overcome the pressure of the hand in forming them. Then put them into the oven and reserve a piece of dough for the next baking. So as far as I know, this is the first example in English anyway of the command to allow dough to proof. Any questions? We'll have some discussion, but I want to move on to flour and then leaven, other fermentation systems. Any questions, comments? So I'm reading this text just to, I think, beat a dead horse, as really a demonstration that in British baking, they didn't know levain. Everybody was using yeast. Though this was about to change. All right, flour. Another circumstance which deserves attention is the quality of the flour, whether fine or coarse. The generality of mankind imagine that it is all the same substance, with a difference of being coarse or fine. But on investigation, it will be found that it is very different. The bran forms the outside coating of the wheat. Immediately under it is that part of the wheat which forms the coarse flour, is of a soft nature and not capable of being easily reduced to a fine flour. This substance constitutes about 1/2 of the grain, is of a sweetish taste, and if taken alone, with a difficulty rises and ferments with leaven or yeast. The kernel or heart of the wheat is a hard substance and almost transparent, is capable of being reduced to a very fine powder, and ferments easily. The French term is roulant. So he's describing, first of all, we're getting technical again. We're moving in to the 21st century here culturally. We've got what they recognized is the bran, and then the next layer of the endosperm, what we call the aleurone, and maybe a little bit further, that breaks up into a granular flour, what Americans call the middlings, what early modern English was the sharps, what modern English is semolina, separate from the Durham semolina, or I guess maybe say semolina for pasta flour, and that the Indians called suja, which we've used in previous talks, and you can all buy at your local Indian grocery if you live anywhere near an Indian community, or else online from Amazon or an Indian supplier. And then lastly, just the inside of the flour gives you the powder, almost true. And then he says in the East Indies, where it is separated by the particular mode of flour making, it's called suja and resembles fine sand. So that's really important for those of you who are doing who are dealing with early modern bread texts. There's so many references to chisel, for example, and this is the middlings. This is the middlings. The suja and resembles fine sand. The millers in this country, from ignorance, often sold this at a low price under the name of sharps, whereas it ought to be returned to the mill and ground as containing the finest part of the flour. I think that French flour sold as gruau, Gruau, is the sifted refined sharps. The rolla in bolting the flour will come out along with the bran and pollard and may then be separated by itself. The mode in which it is done in East Indies is as follows, and this is really fascinating. Flour is ground by hand with stones of about 18 inches diameter. No idea what he means by hand at 18 inches, because that's certainly not with a hand kerned. The wheat is previously soaked in water. Those of you who saw my talk on Egyptian bread, the introduction to Egyptian bread, saw that my friend in Luxor, the woman who taught me how to make bread, that she washed the bread in several changes of water and then dried it in the sun. So I assume we're seeing that here. He then says the pressure and force of these stones is sufficient to grind both the bran and the outer part of the grain, which constitutes the coarse flour, but the kernel of the wheat is not reduced to flour, but appears like fine sand. The whole is then sifted. The flour passes through. So we've got the throughs and the overtails. And the bran, pollard, and suja or roulant remains behind. Okay, so left behind is the bran, the middlings, all this stuff, and the flour has come through. In the 1616 English edition of La Maison Rustique, edited by Markham, he talks about using the French black stones and doing a first pass that does just this. And it's from this, he then says, regrind this other stuff and give it to your servants, and that the finest flour is coming through that pass. But this is interesting. He says that the women are employed to separate the suja, which they do with great address by means of small winnowing fans. And he says the suja or roulant is used for baking a fine bread without being reduced to fine flour, and the flour sold to the common people to make cakes. He goes on to say, and remember, we made something with suja the other day in this group, and once you hydrate it, you're going to find it becomes a really nice bread. It was a flour used in the bread the pain de luxe in the 19th century in French bread recipes. The Indian principle of making flour may be adopted with great advantage in this country. The stones ought to be set so as to yield half the weight of the wheat in flour, and proper machinery constructed for separating the roulin or suja for use, as there's no necessity of grinding that again into flour. By this means, the mill will be enabled to grind a third or half more in the same time, and the stones do not require half the picking. The roulin or suja will be found of two different qualities, the one finer and the other, and nearly of equal quantities. So he's just describing what the French call mouture économique. So you all, when this talk is over and you are inspired, go to Google Books and search mouture, M-O-U-T-U-R-E, économique. And the French divided milling between this mouture économique and mouture rustique. The rustic milling is the one-pass milling that all of us from the English-speaking world think stone milling was really about. In fact, they were doing multi-pass milling. They were really doing reduction milling, just like So many artists and bakers complain about the modern roller mill, that it is slowly reducing the grain smaller and smaller, and there's all the sifting and regrinding. Well, that is exactly what we do in Mouture Économique. I'm going to share one slide here because it shows you the experimenting and what you can expect. Where is that slide? It is. Come on, William. It is right here. And we'll make it look better. Okay, everybody see that slide. So what's great about this book, of course, you can all get it now from Google Books, but I will be at some point in a couple of weeks sending you my annotated draft. So here he's showing you what you get from the first grinding, and then he's sifting and regrinding parts of it. And what is important is you're going to end up with almost no bran in the end. Almost every bit is going to be turned into flour. It's quite extraordinary. You can also look up the term high milling. High milling was a system that the British used in the 19th century that did a little bit of this. There was some grinding and regrinding, though nowhere near so sophisticated as you see here. Any questions about this Mouture Économique? Enough that you can hold it for later. So the important thing is that not only is Cochrane controlling the taste through this multi-build system, and he does say if you've got super sour, super bitter hoppy beer or super sour leaven, you can divide your flour into 6, 8, or 10 parts, and slowly, I think, as Ken said, you just slowly build. You just build up. Just remember, each time, don't add more flour than you added the time before. So he also is into fermentation systems. He says, this is really just totally incredible, In the East Indies, bread is raised and baked by a liquor called toddy, which is drawn from the cocoa nut tree. As the mode of extracting this liquor by every information is either unknown or not practiced in the West Indies, where it might not only be valuable on account of the property it possesses of raising flour in the same manner as yeast, but also to promote fermentation in the distilling of rum. It should now be detailed. So I think, Ken, for your fermentation group, this is a fantastic text. He describes how you tap the coconut tree and make palm wine. And then he's using that palm wine. He says that in India, they are using, in Bengal, they are using this as the ferment to get their bread going. So I'm thinking, extending the idea, is that sort of any fruit wine you could, make up and just use that to start your bread. A lot of people use grapes. There's a very beautiful story in the Wikipedia you will find on Acme Bakery, the great Berkeley bakery started by Steve Sullivan. His father is a wine historian, and it's really moving. They went together to a winery, to a vineyard, picked some grapes, and that formed the starter that Acme Bakery is still using today. And it's also nice, if you create something like that, because it also preserves a memory. You then have sort of a starter of memory. He then is going on here, fermentation. So there was a problem. I have not been able to find out what happened, but something happened in the distilleries in the 1790s, and there may have been a strike at some point. There may have been something with taxes, because there was a point in Scotland where all the distilleries shut down, and the bakers were really in trouble. In modern American English, we could say they were up shit creek. or up a canoe without a paddle, however it goes. They're in trouble. And the Scottish bakers then invented a yeast, and it got to be known as Scottish barms. If you go online and look up Parisian barm, or Scottish barm, you're going to get to one of these recipes that he's got here. And Ken, that would again be, I think, interesting for one of your fermentation things. So I will read to you here one of the, no, this is next, one of the recipes. He says, the process of making yeast as practiced in Edinburgh is as follows. Take 2 ounces of hops, boil them for an hour in 2 gallons of water, and boiling hot, scald 8 or 10 pounds of flour and stir it well into a paste. Do this about 11 in the forenoon. Let it stand till 6 o'clock in the evening, then add about a quart of yeast to forward the fermentation and mix it very well together. Next morning, add about as much flour and water, sufficient to make it into dough, and in the afternoon, it will be fit for setting sponge and baking. Reserve always a piece of the old dough to mix with the new batch instead of the yeast, which is necessary only the first time to hasten the process. The above quantity of hops will suffice for 120 quartern loaves. And remember, we had the talk on quartern loaves. They're roughly 4 pounds, 8 ounces. I didn't read you the section on hops, but he does say it has recently been discovered that hops retard sourness, and you are going to find hops in all yeast systems, including if you go to 19th century American cookbooks, there will be sections in the bread books, there'll be recipes that are called yeast and how to make yeast, and they all involve hops. So hops was this flavor in 19th century bread because everybody didn't run it through his system. Here's a letter, dear sir, he's including here, that somebody has written to him. In answer to your favor of the 31st of something, I beg leave to send for your information the following account of the process of making yeast from malt, which I procured from Mr. Gillespie, baker of Leith, who has had it in use for more than a year and intends to still to continue it in preference to distiller's barm or yeast. In the first place, you must have a boiler, cooler, vats, and etc., and all the apparatus that would be necessary in a small distillery. And then he goes on. So again, as our positioning and understanding this text at the cusp of the 18th, of the end of the early modern, the beginning of the modern, suddenly to be a baker, he's advising that you put together a bit of scientific kit. Anything to go back to? Yes, the complaint against essentially the Albion Mill, and then you can take yourself off mute and clap the end of this presentation, and we'll get to a few minutes of questions before our time is up. He said it is hitherto been a desideratum to ascertain the real fine, okay, actually this is a bit separate. Where is that mill thing? Well, I may have lost it. He's going to complain, that they use these mills that can reduce everything to fine flour in one pass. So without using the roller mill, with steam engines, they were able to get the middlings into a powdery enough form to sell it as white flour. But it got so hot that it killed the dough, and so bakers referred to that flour as quote dead, quote dead, end quote. But this passage I'm going to end with, because it's again where we don't know what something is, but we know what it is. Oh no, that is here. This mode of grinding is very prejudicial as from the severe pressure of the stones, the flour is rendered dead. Okay, he's testing for gluten. The following experiment, if carefully made, will effectively check all fraud and is therefore of the utmost consequence to be known to bakers in general and to complete guard against imposition. He's concerned about somebody sifting out some part of the flour that's high in gluten and selling it separately, and then sort of cheating people. Take a pound of flour properly ground of a standard quality of wheat, and from which it is certain nothing has been extracted. Moisten it with water and make it into paste. Then knead it in pure water, which repeat in different waters until all the farinaceous part are washed away, and nothing but a substance like an elastic gum remains. Dry this and weigh it, which weight established as the standard fineness of flour, bolted through a cloth of a certain fineness on a pound weight. When the quality of any flour is to be tried, proceed in that method and see whether the proportion of gummy matter is more or less than the standard. If less, it's been robbed of so much of the roulant, and the quantity may be accurately ascertained to the utmost nicety by any person of modest capacity. So here we have the flour board, right? Testing the wheat. Here we have the kind of tests that, of course, are standard for any baker that is commercial. This, of course, will be the heart of any advice that Paratos is going to give to the many people who buy their products. Be sure you know the quality of that flour that you start with, and they're performing this kind of tests. Now, in closing, I want to say that I did try to see if I could find any gluten figures, because I thought, wow, that would tell us how much gluten is in their wheat. Is it 11.7? Is it 12.3? Is it 8.5? I couldn't find that because, of course, they're not using the word gluten. But there is a bread treatise from the 1850s where they've done this, but they get 22 to 25% gluten. So I think this method is actually not going to tell you enough for to get back to an agronomic solution. What kind of wheat did they use, and for reenactors, what was the exact gluten content of an early modern bread. So that is the end of the talk today. Thank you all very, very much. So you can go. Thank you.